So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third session of our webinar cycle Beyond Winter and Spring. Since there are people that are still connecting, we're gonna wait another couple of minutes before starting. In the meantime, let me just give you a couple of informations about the cycle and our center. Our center, the Center for Social Science Research and Action, it's a Beirut-based independent research center whose main bulk of research activity is focused on civil society and the question of social justice in the Arab world. Currently, we are pushing forward a research project concerning precisely the question of social justice in the region that we are approaching according to two major streams. One related to the systems of social protection and another one related to the social movements that are mobilizing to achieve a greater equality in the region. And we decided to organize this thematic webinar series whereby we're trying to somehow make a state of the art of social contention in the region after 2011. And we're doing it with a double end. First of all, to trace what actually is mobilizing the region and why. And second, also to try to trouble the institutionalist and dichotomical paradigms whereby the historical evolution of the region after 2011 has been predominantly understood. Understanding that starting from a consideration of the so-called first wave of uprising as a sheer popular mobilization to achieve a regime change in a liberal sense, looked at the aftermath and elaborated its evaluations of what actually those mobilizations produce, only looking at if these movements managed or not to achieve an institutional liberal democratic model. And we want to trouble it because it's our consideration that this sort of eventful approach hides more than it reveals. Because in effect, what was at the core of the quest expressed by those squares back then, of course, it entailed somehow a quest for a greater political freedoms and for a regime change. It was absolutely evident, but the great core of request had much more to deal with bread and dignity. And the same quest for bread and dignity is keeping informing mobilizations in the region. So having this introduction, this general introduction been done, let's come up to today's session that will tackle in particular what happened in what have been the two main vanguards, if we want to say, of the revolutionary process of 2011, and namely Tunisia and Egypt. Tunisia and Egypt that in this sort of dichotomic reading of the post have been assumed as the two archetypes of the winter and the spring. Winter corresponding with Egypt, where after the revolution whose anniversary is extremely fresh. It dates back to 2 days ago as of 2011. After having reason, high hopes for a genuine change in pace, ultimately ended up with an authoritarian setback, especially after al-Sisi's coup in 2013. And on the other hand, Tunisia, that on the contrary has been generally portrayed as the main, if not the sole real successful spring. And in this dichotomy, while if we want, I'm sorry, I got lost a little bit, but I mean, the subtext within this dominant reading is that if on the one hand in Egypt, there's no more room for social mobilization, on the other hand, in Tunisia, there are not any more democratic problems. And how we will better see through the presentations of our speakers, this is not the case at all. In Tunisia, since last July, we're seeing that there has been a sort of authoritarian retrenchment in progress in a very particular fashion, but actually we see that the country is still pretty far from being this perfect archetype of democratization as it has been portrayed. Plus, social mobilizations have never stopped occurring after 2011, while on the other hand, if there is this common perception of Egypt as a country where contentious politics are not anymore possible, on the contrary, we will see that despite the restriction of the political space for mobilization, actually mobilizations are occurring. So I will not go further, and I will leave the floor straight to Laryssa Chomiak, with whom we will discuss precisely about what this democratization of Tunisia actually is. Laryssa Chomiak, political scientist and founder with Jill Chandler of the Sidi Bouzid School of Critical Protest Studies and associate fellow at Chatham House in London, plus director of the Centre d'études Maghrébines at Tunis. So please, Laryssa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rossana, the Center for Social Science Research Action, Madeleine, and the entire team for having me today. I apologize ahead of time if I'm not going to address the protest and social movement question that I've spoken about quite a lot, and I'm taking this presentation in a bit of a different direction, but I'm happy to address any questions about some of the kind of contentious politics focus in the Q&A if there's interest. I'm very excited about today's event and also, of course, the opportunity to speak a bit about my work and thoughts on Tunisia, especially as the seminar series critiques the normative and institutional, or as you said, the winter spring or democracy authoritarianism dichotomy that has guided so much analysis since the uprisings of 2011 and obviously before as well. As this series addresses, this dichotomous approach has not only dominated political science trends with a very clear liberal commitment, but also, and perhaps more significantly, it has steered debate on the political present to an exclusive focus, and here again I'm speaking about Tunisia, to an exclusive focus on how to rescue Tunisia, the Arab Spring's sole democratic success, whether over the past decade or following the events that began this past summer of 2021. 3 points, or maybe 3 ideas guide my presentation today. The first is the idea of Tunisia as a democratic exception to the region's authoritarianism as an instance of a successful transition amidst the failed uprisings elsewhere. In critiquing this obsession, we can clearly also see limitations in work on regime type, generalizability, and ripple effects. We can also see the problems this penchant for reading Tunisia as an exception has on recognizing the actual idiosyncrasies and particularities of states, experiences, and histories. So just because it happened in Tunisia, there's an assumption that it didn't happen elsewhere when there's so much going on, as there's been so many presentations in this series previously, the work of Gillian Schwedler in Jordan and so on, this assumption that if an uprising fails, nothing is going on in that particular case. The second point is what I think of as the political work of opinion questionnaires about public sentiments, particularly those conducted and published in Tunisia, which together with media work have contributed to an important public sphere in which respondents separate a world before the uprisings from the political present as though these are fully kind of discrete universes. And the third is how these tensions have conflated democratization, often viewed by Tunisians themselves as the source of frustration, with revolution, conversely often viewed as the source of hope, and the implication that conflation has for the real life events that we seek to understand today. In mainstream media, and here I mean in mainstream international media, Tunisia has been simultaneously labeled since 2012, for a decade now, a democratic success, as well as a perpetual democracy in crisis, a democracy on the brink of collapse, a democracy that is suffering from the kind of birth pangs that occur in the first stages of transitions from dictatorship to democracy. The binary of dictatorship and democracy, which more than often coincides with analysis that creates a stark division between revolutionary hope, what people wanted at the specific revolutionary moment, and the massive democratic deceit or the inability of democracy to deliver, has been awkwardly transposed onto an attachment to a specific kind of democratic model, a bourgeois democracy with an egalitarian discourse of social inclusion and an institutional commitment to accelerating economic reforms towards a full-fledged capitalist economic system, one that will be protected by democratic institutions while also, or eventually, strengthening these towards democratic consolidation. So that's kind of the hope that's usually the hope that is ascribed to Tunisia when the country is described as a case in crisis or as a regime in crisis or a process in crisis. But that is not exactly what happened, or at least not exclusively, from the uprisings in 2011 until the complexities of what is going on today. So first, the sheer amount of contentious politics in the form of social movements, protests, as well as sit-ins, wildcat strikes have increased massively since 2011. In 2017, there were, this is just event analysis, about 16,000 protests and strikes and contentious moments registered for that year, which averages about 35 per day. For some, these movements mark multiple versions of the continuity of Tunisia's revolutionary moment, while others have actively labeled them as destructive and not part of the democracy building process. Many of these protest movements have been violently quashed and criminalized at junctures, though at the same time, they have also constituted a principal form of political participation, expression of demands and expectations, a form of negotiation with the state, protection of political institutions that resulted from the revolution, and a series of power-sharing agreements that have followed. Second, there has been a clear trend, and this is since 2018 especially, of diminishing trust in democratic institutions. So these are kind of global public opinion surveys that are measuring trust in political institutions across the region. The Arab Barometer published findings in March of this past year of 2021 that trust in parliament, for instance, in Tunisia was at an all-time low at 15%. So since 2018, there's a kind of stark decrease or in trust in democratic institutions or the new democratic institutions. And then, of course, a visible increase in contentious politics and protest movements, both authorized and unauthorized. The political conflict in this period and onwards was defined by high levels of civic disobedience and violent clashes with the state. And here, I don't mean to suggest that these trends are necessarily in effect of one another, but rather that they're occurring simultaneously and thereby invite us to think about the social question as this panel addresses and how this social question has been reformulated by citizens at the forefront of Tunisia's political transition. So there are those who are actively trying to push these questions outside of the process of democratization. And then there's, at the same time, a contradictory but simultaneous movement of bringing these to the fore of the political present or of the political, of the different moments of the transition. In my own work, I think of Tunisia's present, its political present, by engaging with the widespread tension of a democracy in crisis, or what the widespread disappointment with democracy and its ability to deliver on social services actually means, together with the continuity of its revolution. I'm particularly attuned to citizens' simultaneous feelings of revolutionary nostalgia and collective claims to the revolution's continuity, coupled with a profound frustration and disappointment that this memory evokes until this day. References to that moment at once, so if you reference the moment revolution, or what exactly kind of the reaction is to talking about 2011, at once evoke immense pride, emotional appeal, but also anger and dismissal. I think that the ways in which these contradictory effects play themselves out daily, from rising protests to daily discussions about social frustrations, from dismissing democracy altogether, is critical to our understanding of democracy itself, as it is indicative to what kind of political work is at stake. So the specific contradiction that I address here, one is that is discernible most clearly in the contentious politics that I study, is both hope and disappointment in the revolution as well as democracy. And these concepts, revolution, political transition, democracy, have been collapsed into one, even though there are vastly different political experiences and processes. So when I say the political work that is at stake, I mean that a collapsing of these different political conditions under the rubric of regime typology and limited to a process of political transition, either dictatorship or democracy or a movement in between the two of them, actively overlooks the kind of politics that are at stake. I think a powerful example comes from the widespread trend of it was better before the revolution, which has been registered in public opinion, including media and the variety of opinion questionnaires. Questions in these surveys produce a periodization that structures how respondents think about the revolution. These findings have been solidified in a highly politically divided Tunisian media sphere. The powerful production of how respondents think about the past, I believe, has created new categories of analysis that pit an uncomplicated before to a frustrated and an immensely complicated present. And here to give a few examples. Already in 2012, just a year after the revolution, a major Tunisian newspaper published findings that 42% of Tunisians missed the Ben Ali era. Subsequently, surveys in 2013 and 2014, during the height of the kind of first big political crisis, asked whether Tunisians regretted the fall of the regime and not Ben Ali, whether Ben Ali governed the country better than today's rulers, or whether respondents agreed that the revolution has deepened societal disparities between rich and poor. And by political work, I mean the public playing field that is made possible through this kind of knowledge production, how this stark binary in attitudes between past and present confuses what public commitments to democracy mean. In my own work, I write about how the practice of lumping together the concepts of uprising, revolution, and democracy, specifically by anti-revolutionaries, and this occurs obviously in surveys, in media talk shows, commentaries, and other public venues, becomes a space of producing nostalgia for an authoritarian past. This powerful trend within democratization work has conflated terms and even memory and rendered a pared down reading that citizens are unsatisfied with democracies. And these details signify the kind of political work that is at stake. Okay, so contentious politics in Tunisia over the last decades have brought to the fore a multiplicity of social contradictions. Widespread demands from democracy are about questions of class and distribution, political authenticity, and a performing state, a demand that goes far beyond the electoral proceduralism that is generally equated with thinly liberal notions of democracy, or those notions that are employed in studies of democracy transitions. So the social question is not one of whether citizens want a certain type of regime. The majority of Tunisians prefer democracy over all other systems, as multiple surveys show, but rather that the concern is not about a democracy in perpetual crisis, but rather the inability of a state to deliver on the promises it has made in its various different iterations, and that is pre and post 2011. The crisis to citizens is not the kind of alarmist headline of a democracy collapsing, but the systemic failure of a state delivering social welfare and security, while, as reported by human rights observatories and investigative journalists, state-led violations against citizens persist endemically until this day. The bourgeois democracy that has begun to take shape in Tunisia since 2012 with its commitment to social inclusion has clashed with the demands and hopes of the people. This clash in expectations is perhaps Tunisia's most profound political crisis, one that repeats and reproduces itself as political elites continue to appease public demands by making promises that they are structurally unable to meet. And I'll stop my comments here, and I hope that we can discuss some of these or other elements later in the Q&A.
Here we are. Thank you very much, Laryssa, for this very dense but rich in inputs presentation. And before giving the floor to Brecht De Smet, in the introduction, I forgot to say that we are keeping the Q&A session at the end of the presentations. So if you already, once finished, we will leave the floor to open comments if you feel, but if in the meantime you feel to raise a question, feel free to use the chat, possibly specifying to whom you are addressing the question. So we move now from Tunisia to Egypt, returning, if we want, to the 2011 moment, to trying to trouble another dominant and the understanding of the first wave as a predominantly urban phenomenon with Brecht De Smet, that by investigating the special dynamics of the 2011 moment in Egypt, he will show us how rather there was a huge role played by by rural areas and marginalities more broadly. So Brecht De Smet is a postdoctoral researcher at the Middle East and North Africa Research Group at Ghent University, and is also a visiting fellow at the Middle East Center of the London School of Economics, and author of what has become now a classic, almost, namely Gramscian Tahrir. So please, Brecht, تفضل.
Thank you, Rosanna, for the invitation and also for your profound introduction at the beginning. For a moment, I was afraid that there was little more for me to say. So here we are already more than a decade after the Arab uprisings. Time really flies. I still remember standing on Tahrir Square and thinking that this was really the start of something new. At that time, it was also interesting that many experts and observers and academics were surprised by the events that were going on in the whole of the Arab world. And of course, we were all surprised, I think, by the scale of the protests and by their revolutionary impact and demands. And on the other hand, I don't think we were surprised that there was something happening. Because while a lot of experts had focused their research and their attention to urban centers, to the middle classes, and then in 2011 studying the large-scale mobilizations at Tahrir in Cairo and so on, looking at democratic demands, at social media dynamics, other authors had been studying Egypt and protest movements for a long time. And then I'm thinking of authors like Joe Bainin, Maha Abderrahman, and Alexander, who have really framed the protest within a longer history of contention that was going on in Egypt. Moreover, I think they've also shown that protests happened not only in metropolitan Cairo, but also in provincial towns, in rural areas, formulating in the first instance not really political demands for democracy, but social demands, demands also for social justice, for dignity, against corruption, and so on. And this, of course, was against the wider backdrop of dispossession, of heightened exploitation, especially in the 1990s and 2000s with neoliberal reform in Egypt. These protests often remained smaller, sometimes even invisible, not only to Western observers, but also at the national level. They were seldomly reported in the national media, for example. After the repression or deflection of mass uprisings in Tunisia and in Egypt, we saw kind of a second wave of new mass protests in Algeria and Sudan. So a lot of attention then was focused on these countries as saving the Arab uprisings. And indeed, I think, of course, they were very important mobilizations. By the way, it's also interesting in Sudan that protests also started in more provincial areas before becoming more visible nationally and abroad in the capital, Khartoum. And that there was also a kind of alliance between urban middle classes and different layers of the working class in Sudan. But in the meantime, protests still continued in Egypt and what we could call the margins of society. And I think this invites us to think of revolution really as a process of which the uprising is but one key moment. I think Laryssa also explained the difference between a revolution and an uprising. And it also, I think, stimulates us to think a bit against the classical definitions of Samuel Huntington, Theda Skocpol, which see revolutions in consequentialist terms, so that there has to be some kind of successful regime change, and this is then the benchmark of a revolution. But more, it allows us to think more in terms of revolution, like Jack Goldstone does, in the sense of the kind of changing and developing demands, desires, intentions, changing forms of organizations, repertoires of action within these kinds of mass movements. It also invites us to think about revolution as a temporal dynamic, in the sense of Tilly's and Tarrow's cycle of contention. So sometimes little seem to be happening, and at other times suddenly we see kind of mass movements. And I think Nadine's work also with regard to labor protests really fits into that framework. But more than a kind of temporal dynamic, there's also a kind of social spatial dynamic going on. So we see that there is a flow, a wave, if you want, of protests going from the margins of society to the center of society and back again. And I think also in one of her papers, Nadine mentions the periphery. So we'd be curious on how she maybe will develop this in her own talk. And finally, I think, of course, maybe against Hannah Arendt and Theda Skocpol, and maybe a bit more with Rosa Luxemburg, that the social dimension of revolutions cannot be neatly separated from the political dimension. There is no such thing as a clean political revolution and a clean social revolution. They are rather different moments that each at a certain time come to dominate the process. The same arguments I think we could also make about counter-revolution. So counter-revolution is not something that happens, it's not an event, it's also not a kind of force. There are, of course, counter-revolutionary forces, but it's also a kind of a process. It's a process that is both concentrated, top-down, really the police, the security forces, but also very much an everyday ongoing process, a fragmented process. A process that preempts as well as reacts to revolution using fear, intimidation, repression, but also cooptation and fragmentation of opposition. And counter-revolution can even cloak itself in the language of democracy. I think this is especially what we have seen in Egypt between 2011 and 2013, how the whole discourse of democratic transition was also used to demobilize the streets, to really channel revolutionary energy and desire from below into kind of electoralism that did not have any real impact on what is called the deep state in Egypt. So maybe let's turn more concretely to Egypt. So of course we have a longer history of contention in Egypt, and I think apart from the political protests around Palestine and democracy and these things in the 2000s, already in the 1990s we saw struggles of farmers in the countrysides. An author like Ray Bush already wrote about that in the 90s, and these remained largely invisible. I think here we clearly see that from the 1990s onwards, groups that had been protected under Nasserist state-led development, they became more and more marginalized in the era of neoliberal reform. Farmers in the first instance, I think, but also other groups. There is an extension of the informal sector, but also industrial workers who were seen as kind of the backbone of the nationalist, developmentalist project were more and more marginalized, both in the public sector and in the newly privatized sectors. The 2011 uprising then really opened up a space for the massification and radicalization of these movements. So we saw the rise of independent trade unions, and although many peasants did not actually participate in the uprising of 2011, we really saw after the deposal of Mubarak, we saw that this opening gave also energy and a kind of hope to peasants. We then see peasant movements in the Nile Delta, but also in the south. And authors such as Francesco De Lelis, Akram Noor, Ahmed Abu Zaid, Hiba Khalil have written, I think, very interesting things about these movements, which again remained largely invisible. And then after 2011, you kind of see the counter-revolution crushing these movements in different waves of cooptation and concession, but especially, of course, by repression and isolation of activists and leaders. And this process was, of course, already happening during the 18 days of the uprising, and especially after Mubarak was disposed, there was immediately a kind of discourse that strikes and social demands created fitna, chaos, and were fi'awi, sectional, whereas political demands were universal and which creates, in the end, a kind of groundwork for social justice. Despite this kind of discourse and this kind of negative approach to social demands, to strikes, there was still a huge explosion of social movements. Why? Because the state was very weak still at that point until the fall of Morsi in 2013. The state was really on the defensive. And then Sisi's coming to power changed all of this. And the battle against the Brotherhood was used to reforge the unity of the state, to tighten the connections between the military, the security apparatus, former regime actors, but also elements of the revolutionary opposition. And of course, a famous example is the cooptation of Kamal Abu Aita, the founder of the Egyptian Federation of Independent Trade Unions, who became Minister of Manpower and Immigration in July 2013. And again, I have to refer to Nadine, who also explained in a recent article how organized labor was subsequently marginalized after Sisi came to power. So on the one hand, we kind of see a counter-revolution triumphant, but on the other hand, it would be too simple, I think, to say that the revolutionary process was completely eradicated. So in January 2014, For example, there was again a strike at the Suez Steel Company factories. There were labor actions in the Nile Delta, in Alexandria. In 2015 alone, more than 1,000 labor protests were still documented, despite all the ongoing state intimidation and violence against workers. In September 2019, in Suez, a small group of youth protesters even called explicitly for Sisi's resignation. You see women and children throwing rocks at APCs, etc., etc. There are villagers and marginalized groups in rural areas that demonstrated against poverty, corruption, but also became a large issue in 2019, 2020, the demolition of illegally built houses, which led to massive arrestations of protesters and activists. I think some 4,000 activists, protesters were being detained. And I think if we talk about, let's say, political opportunities in a context of authoritarianism, it's also interesting to think about the context of the pandemic. So very recently, and research by Sharkawi and Ali goes into more detail about this, we can see how the pandemic, of course, on the one hand, creates new obstacles and challenges for social movements, and often gives the security apparatus excuses, or more excuses to intervene. And on the other hand, it also creates openings for certain social movements. For example, the healthcare workers, obviously, who are in the front lines of the fight against the pandemic, now have taken on a kind of role of whistleblowing, pointing out the underfunded and disintegrating health sector, the low pay and bad working conditions for doctors and nurses, the understaffed hospitals, but also the entanglement with the military sector. So the military's involvement ranges from the construction and exploitation of hospitals to even the production of baby formula. And also visually, the military wants now to identify itself with this health sector in times of crisis. So suddenly social demands, because in the end, the healthcare workers' demands are about working conditions, about wages, about the long hours that they have to spend on their work. They are becoming more and more public national issues instead of merely particularist social issues. So the health sector workers are now even called Egypt's White Army, which is of course interesting in a military dominated discourse. But the stories of bad working conditions have been shared in traditional media and on social media, and this kind of whistleblowing, it started in the center of society, literally geographically in Cairo, but also socially by doctors and pharmacists, and by now has spread to healthcare workers around the country, and also nurses. And this again, I think shows how protests can flow from the margins to the center and back again. And it's very interesting to see the political opportunity of pandemic politics at work. You could say that the pandemic, is kind of an external trigger, but of course the specific impact and problems of the Egyptian healthcare sector are very much internal to the kind of system or regime that is in place in Egypt. So I think today, a very concrete question could be, is this form of contention by healthcare workers, is it possible for it to become a rallying point for other social groups who maybe recognize themselves in the demands of the healthcare workers and criticisms? And in any case, the challenges remain very much the same. Without an alliance with political activists and middle classes, it will be very difficult to, again, formulate a criticism of the regime will be very difficult to formulate the specific demands in a more general language, a language for example, a national minimum wage and so on, challenging, in fact, the authoritarian state. There are lingering challenges of horizontal organization in the sense of networking, forging federations between different social movements that actually work, unlike the previous experiments. Challenges of vertical organization, to have stable structures, again, learning from the mistakes of the independent trade unions in the past. And of course, how to deal with the security apparatus in an efficient way. So I want to end here with these kind of open questions, because I think also that Nadine will probably also go into more detail about these issues. Thank you.
I have a lot of questions for you, so get ready. We have about 30 minutes for the Q&A. So before leaving the floor to the audience, I would like just to make some concluding remark, also taking into consideration what has emerged from the previous session. And one of the issues, as I already said before, is the question of the importance of social marginalities, or because in effect they played a role in 2011 and have not been that has not been researched properly, or because after 2011 are occupying an increasing important position in contentious politics. And this is something that is very typical of Tunisia. We saw that in Jordan, protests are decentralizing more and more, but in the very Lebanon, I mean, what gave to the 2019 uprising its real propulsive force was the activation of peripheral, not only peripheral areas, but also of social marginalities, so informal workers, petty bourgeoisie, or I mean, constituencies that usually do not take the street. And this raises a question that somehow connects with Nadine's presentation, with the fact that, in effect, the impression that I'm having is that the social fabric of the region has consistently changed through the neoliberal transition, political structures, because of cooptation, because of more global phenomena typical of neoliberal citizenship have changed. And but at the same time, we have not elaborated yet the instruments, the theoretical instruments to investigate those changes. And boom, I dropped the bomb and I give the floor to the question. So I will start from a question that we received during the presentation, which is by Ahmed Loft, PhD candidate in Scuola Normale Superiore, the question is for both for Laryssa and Brecht, and is regarding the question of revolution continuity. Now he just says that his PhD project is aiming to make a comparison between the Sudanese and the Egyptian revolution. So his question is, where do you think, if first of all, there are some learning processes at stake between different mobilization poles, and the question is, where do you think this learning process starts? Does it even exist? If it is not passed by through senior junior activists, like in other cases outside the Arab world, how do you think it gets embedded in the collective subconscious of Moses. And since we are here, I also give you 4 questions that we received before the beginning of the webinar so that we collect them and we do this first round. And then if there is someone else who wants to ask a question, just feel free to drop it in the chat or just raise the hand. So the first question is, I would like to ask about the electoral systems in Egypt and Tunisia after the revolution. Have they changed? If yes, what is the form of this change? And how did the new electoral systems contribute to upholding the values of citizenship, including participation in the public sphere and easing conflicts in the Tunisian and Egyptian societies? So the first question. The second one is, what do you think is the most negative ramification of the Arab Spring? And what is the most hopeful change it brought about? Big question. The third one is, what are the systemic cracks and opportunities available for anti-regime actors to exploit in both contexts? Are anti-establishment groups organized enough to take advantage of these opportunities as they may emerge? And the last one is always about if it's possible to compare Sudan with Egypt and Algeria as well. So it's pretty contiguous with the very, very first one. So I will proceed with this round. Feel free to tackle one issue more than one or skip others if you don't feel to answer. And then after this round, we will go with the second one. Yes.
May I start, Rosanna?
Yes.
Yeah. I want to start with Ahmed's question about learning processes. I think it's a very interesting question, also because my PhD, in fact, dealt to a large extent with learning processes before 2011 that led to some of the movements in 2011, and the role of journalists and intellectuals and political activists and so on in developing let's say, the resources and repertoires that would lead to the uprising. So, of course, there is an aspect of collective memory that played an important role, but sometimes you also see in certain cases that the old generation also posed a break for a new generation of activists, and that they had to be creative and inventive and create their own traditions. And I think it's largely a learning process that became very much interrupted by the process of counter-revolution. And in a way, we could also understand counter-revolution as that which precisely interrupts this kind of collective learning process by separating activists and their audiences, by fragmenting the experiences that different forms of social and political activists have, and so on. So I'm very much interested in your project, and I think we should be in contact. It also brings me to the second question about the most negative ramification, because if we think about the whole process of revolution as a collective learning process that is now to a large extent being interrupted, let's say the most negative ramification maybe is that if we look back, it took a whole generation to go back into the streets after the 1970s in Egypt, when we had the last street protest. And now maybe we have a whole generation again, which is demoralized, politically passive, disillusioned in street politics. So that might be the most negative ramification. On the other hand, there is maybe among some activists still legacy of 2011 in their memory that dictators can be brought down by mass movements from below. Maybe that's the most hopeful change that the uprisings brought. Which then I think brings me to the third question about systemic cracks and opportunities. Of course, you can be disillusioned, you can be passive and demoralized, but at the same time, the obstacles you face in your daily life are huge, and you have to find your way around them. And for example, the pandemic shows how there are still opportunities for mobilization and for protests. And on the other hand, if we look at the Egyptian economy, it's an economy that has been in collapse since ever, almost for a few decades, which really is putting people against the wall. And I think maybe people don't want to go on protest; they almost never do. But at a certain point, it will become again necessary to do so. And then we arrive back at what I think is the main problem, and that is the problem of organization of movements, parties, of trade unions, and so on. Andrea, I will think a bit about your question first.
Rosanna, can I answer?
Sure.
Can I add to Ahmed's question, which I think is a fantastic question also. I generally don't, so I think it's really interesting to think about it as a learning process. And also I think it depends on what precisely it is that you're looking at, because of course there is this kind of generational passing on of how you push against something. So whether it's in the form of manifestos or kind of like cross-ideological, mobilization, in the form of humor, all these things kind of, pass on and change over time as well. So there's definitely a connectivity. But I think what the opportunity of the uprisings of 2011 is just the visibility of the sheer kind of variety of contentious politics that we see beyond the kind of classic social movement or the classic labor mobilization. So in the form of infrastructural stoppage, in the form of stopping production, whether it's around extractive economic areas, in the form of blockages, in the form of not allowing. So kind of depending on what the grievance is, whether it's around stopping production, whether it's about stopping employees entering a factory or managers entering a factory, whether it's stopping boats and ships from leaving ports and so on, are all different kinds of forms that have become so much more, I think, pronounced. I'm obviously looking at it from a Tunisian case, but I think that that's something that we didn't necessarily see before. And then there's a more recent learning process. So when it works, and let's say the union responds, or the factory responds, or the business responds, or the local elites respond by negotiating with protesters, by negotiating jobs and social services and so on, or housing or schools and so on. There is that kind of learning process that repeats itself a lot. And I think that's something that when you're talking about the cracks and the question that you asked about the kind of cracks, they don't necessarily have to be cracks in the regime. So they don't have to be the classical political opportunities that we learn in theories of democratic transition, but they can be the very cracks that kind of contentious mobilization also provides. And that's what a lot of authorities are also scared of. Then the question that you asked, or the comment about the continuity of the revolution, I also thought was really interesting. At the 10-year anniversary, I know that Tunisia is not one of your case studies, but perhaps this helps you think through some of the cases that you're writing about. At the 10-year anniversary of the Tunisian revolution last year in 2021, the protest movement was immense. And it was also perhaps that January 14th that was met with the kind of highest and most intense state-led violence against the protest, in part because protests broke pandemic curfews, pandemic-related curfews, and were unauthorized as in previous years they were authorized. And so what a lot of the slogans at the 10-year revolutionary did is they kind of combined the grievances of the last decade and brought a lot of different things that seemed to be dispersed together at that particular moment, each in different ways making claims to that continuity depending on what precisely the grievance was. So I think that depending on what kind of mobilization you're particularly interested in or writing about has perhaps different mechanisms in which it reproduces itself and also changes over time.
Okay, thank you so much. We still have 10 minutes. Oh, please.
Maybe going to Andrea's question, I think it's a difficult question, and unfortunately, I can't answer it. I think for Egypt, I think that probably the best reason is that I'm not really in touch with what's going on in Egypt right now, because it has been a while since I've been able to do fieldwork there. On the other hand, if I look at social protests in Tunisia, in Algeria, and in Morocco, what has emerged there is a kind of rallying behind the concept of tahmish, so marginalization. And in a way, probably the previous session also talked about this. And in a way, this is both, I think, the consequence of real material processes of dispossession, heightened exploitation, marginalization, exclusion of groups, and so on. And at the same time, also a concept that might function as a concept for alliances between different groups in an urban or in a rural setting. So maybe this, and of course the Maghreb context then could be such a kind of discursive and material concept to forge new kinds of alliances for change.
Thank you so much. Now, if there isn't any new questions, no? Yes? No? Okay, so I will make one. And this is on the point of nostalgia that Laryssa touched. So on the one hand, how the failure of regimes in delivering the social benefits, if we want, the social protection that citizens expect is producing authoritarian nostalgia. I was wondering if this is happening in Egypt too. And second, if among activists, nostalgia is acting as a paralyzing force, or if according to the cases, it's acting or it's being strategized to produce action. Like we were like this, let's get back to be like this, or oh, we were like this, we're not anymore. And what kind of dynamics associated to nostalgia are at stake?
So so what happened in 2011, so Tunisia has had, like any other place, so it's not exceptional in any way around this, has had so many different forms of anti-regime opposition and mobilization before 2011. It was just, again, it's kind of the effect of the, sustainable authoritarianism literature, that it was such a kind of sustained dictatorship where these forms were not necessarily visible and then suddenly became visible in December of 2010, which then resulted in a nationwide movement. And one of the characteristics of that movement was the not just the euphoria around it, but also what seemed to be the momentary agreement among different political actors about what was happening at that specific moment. And what's really interesting, I also, Rosanna, I wanted to thank you for not asking me to talk about July 25th, 2021, because that's just goes into like a whole different thing. I was going to answer the question about the electoral code, which just as a bracket is one of the main kind of agenda items of what Kais Saied wants to reform this next year because of his own dissatisfaction with the electoral code. But to go back, there were kind of two moments where quantitative, if you will, or overwhelming support for a common project came together. And that was the toppling of Ben Ali. And then 8 years later, the support of Kais Saied in the 2019 elections. But, and I think that the role of nostalgia is really important here. I would love to hear from, my colleagues who work on Egypt, because I think this was very profoundly a play before 2013 as well. But what has happened is that overwhelming moment of solidarity in that was kind of then quickly mapped onto we all agree on democracy and we all agree on this kind of democracy, which I think is problematic in 2012. But that moment of solidarity, there was I think smaller, which grew over time, force at play, which were these staunch old regime figures that together with other powerful forces, economic forces and political forces, were actively trying to promote a stable pre-2011 period and a completely unstable and chaotic, not a contentious, but a chaotic post-2011 period, and thereby kind of diminishing the effect that the revolution can have on other forms of solidarity and mobilization as well. And I think that the most powerful way to make that happen was to create the kind of nostalgia for a stable past and separating that stability from the actual dictatorial reality of the period of the 27, if not longer period of previous 2011 regimes. There's that part to the nostalgia. The other thing is that there is a generation of the huge generation of young Tunisians who are increasingly voting and who perhaps voted for the first time in 2019, who have known no other regime but the previous regime. So they have lived through what they understand to be a period of stability versus a period of complete instability. And the way in which nostalgia plays to galvanize the support and memory of what that previous regime, however brutal, looked like is incredibly powerful. And I think the example that I gave through some of the opinion surveys and media work and so on, and opinion analysis is not the only thing that is at play. It's just one of many that is producing the possibility to even think about an atrocious regime as the previous one as something that could possibly be better than the chaos that is associated with democracy. Of course, the chaos is not associated with democracy. The chaos is associated with the inability for the regime to be reformed and deliver, and where social disparities are much more visible than, or perhaps pronounced than they were before. But that's kind of what these specific players, I think, are trying to create. So this idea that there is an unproblematic past, and we wish we could return to that unproblematic past, but now we have to deal with this problematic and chaotic present that is just simply not going away. And I think that opens up the opportunity for quite a lot of support for anti-democratic forces.
Okay, thank you so much for the answer. So unfortunately, we have to close our session by 4:30 Beirut time. This time it's mandatory. There were 2 further questions who were dropped during this last answer for Laryssa. So I would forward it to you, and maybe you can answer to the person who raised it privately, unfortunately. But so since we have 1 minute, I would like to thank you all for having accepted the invitation. and for all the audience for having attended and have participated so intensely in the Q&A part. So we will come back soon with our fourth session that would be most likely devoted to Algeria and Sudan. That was in the air today, so maybe let's say that it's a projection for the next chapter. And thank you so much again, and have a nice weekend, you all.